Hello, this is Nima Golbabai on KUCI 88.9 Irvine. This is my show, Cinéshow. Today we are taking a break from movies and we're going to be talking about some controversial subject matter and relevant subject matter with my former professor, hopefully future professor, if I can get into his class, Daniel Levine, Rabbi Daniel Levine, and we're going to be talking about the Israel-Palestine debate and the current war in the Middle East. So, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, it's great to be back here. I think this is time number either 3 or 4 on the show, so thank you for re-inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. I think it is our third, or maybe 4, you're right. But, yeah, I think we should get into, how did the Jews get back to the land of Israel or Palestine, depending on your point of view? Like, how did that happen and why did that happen?
It's a great question. I think they can, have full books written on that question. So just to give a couple of bullet points, and then, we can let that transition into current events. One, it's important to note that there was always a continued Jewish connection to the land. I'll just call it the land to avoid any labeling politics. I think actually words, especially words like, either Israel or Palestine or Zionism, do in a sense a lot of disservice because people have different formulations in their head of what those words mean. And so if I use the word like Zionism, everybody has a preconceived notion, whether positive or negative, by the way, and they're not even going to listen to the rest of what I say. If they really like Zionism, it'll be a plus. If they hate Zionism, it'll be a minus. So I'll just try to be as vague or explanatory as possible whenever I use terms. So there was always a continued Jewish connection to the land for what's considered the 2,000 years of diaspora or exile in the Jewish community. And, for anybody who does want to, one day take my class, Major Jewish Text, you'll sort of see through a textual perspective or a ideas perspective, Jews that were living all throughout the diaspora. So there were virtually Jews spread out, modern-day Babylonia, Iran, Iraq, all the way to Europe, all the way to North Africa, eventually to the Americas. There really was a Jewish presence almost anywhere in the world that you imagine, people lived over the last 2,000 years. But all of those Jews continuously were connected to the land of Israel and really Jerusalem as a spiritual center. So just a couple of, bullet points, Jews have always prayed towards the direction of Jerusalem. So if you're in Spain or if you're in America, that means facing east. If you were in, Iran or Iraq, that means facing west towards Jerusalem. And it was sort of just a continued Jewish practice of really imagining, and part of the Jewish psyche in the world over the last 2,000 years is, maybe we're happy, maybe we're not happy in whichever land in which we live, but we're not at home, right? We have this place of wanderingness or unrootedness, and we're all waiting to get back to the land of Israel. And so this idea was sort of kept alive in Judaism. It was more connected to messianic impulses. If you can imagine, in the 15 and 1600s, if you were to talk about a return to the land of Israel, and here I'm using the land of Israel as opposed to the state of Israel. There is a nuanced difference there if you want to get into it. But there was this idea of a return to the land of Israel, or Eretz Yisrael, as it's talked about in Jewish sources, but it wasn't really ever acted upon in a major way until the late 1800s, where you have the rise of what's called, political Zionism or modern Zionism. And that was, again, a modern movement that started in Western Europe. And modern Zionism very much took from two completely different sets of inspirations, right? On the one hand, Herzl and other early political Zionists took from this long legacy of tradition of Jewish connection to the land, mixed with what they saw to be the biggest problem facing Jews in Europe, especially Western Europe, at the turn of the 19th century, which is this persistent question of anti-Semitism and belonging, and the fact that it didn't make a difference who was in charge in Europe, right? You can have the Catholic Church in charge in the 1500s, or you can have this, post-Enlightenment secular government, whether it's, very left-wing, socialistic or Marxist, or far right-wing, which eventually devolved into, Hitler and Nazism, right? Herzl was theorizing about the Jewish future for his time, it was Europe, and he came to this conclusion: the only way to really cure or solve or protect Jews against anti-Semitism was in the form of self-determination within a nationalistic framework. And so he kind of took those two ideas, and, this isn't just one person, but Theodor Herzl is thought to be the father of modern Zionism, right? There's all sorts of ways we can nitpick and, talk about earlier inspirations or, it being a group of people. But he sort of took these ideas and mixed them together of this, age-old Jewish impulse to return mixed with this modern, nationalistic, more European-centric model. And that then started, again, waves of immigration and Jews. Again, it started mostly from Europe, but then eventually, the rest of the Jewish world, throughout the 20th century, people from really all around ended up moving to, again, what we now call Israel/Palestine.
Yeah. So, in short, like, Zionism, which I feel a lot of people don't actually know the definition, like what the word means, is it's basically like Jewish liberal nationalism and the idea that Jews should have a state and a home of their own. And also, what I was thinking is there's like lots of stateless people in the world, right? So especially in the Middle East, like there's the Kurds, who are a very big ethnic group that don't have a state in the Middle East, and many other smaller groups that actually some people support a state for and some people don't, but it's hard to say. And I was wondering, what do you think is like the biggest justification for the state of Israel? Is it because of like the discrimination Jews have faced? Is it the religious reason? Is it the cultural? Is it the ethnic? Or is it because like, and hopefully you can get into this, like who are the Jews like living in like Ottoman Palestine, or even before then, like, and how long were they there and whatnot?
Yeah, so two very different questions. Let's tackle the second one first, just because it's an easier question. It's a shorter conversation. So there was a continued Jewish presence really everywhere in the Middle East for 2,000 years. So just the very quick history, and again, if you want to have the more complicated version, again, there's infinite reading material on this. But in the year 70 CE, the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the center of the Jewish world, was destroyed by the Roman Empire. About 65, 67 years later, there was a Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. Once the Bar Kokhba Revolt failed, the Roman Empire basically kicked Jews out of the majority of the land of Israel. And so the vast majority of Jews ended up fleeing either east to Babylonia or south down to Alexandria or Egypt or the rest of North Africa. And that then started, again, this spreading outness of Jews, or really this dispersion, to the fact that today, no one's surprised to meet a Jew from, both France, Italy, South America, Cuba, right? People in the Jewish community are sort of aware of the fact that there's all sorts of different ethnic shades of Jews. And that's really could be traced back in a major way to this formative dispersion 2,000 years ago. There were, of course, Jews who did stay in what's considered the Near East. So let's just say, Syria, Egypt, the land of Israel, Lebanon, those places that are, the closest countries in the Middle East to us here. And so when the Ottoman Empire eventually took over, it's a wider history, right? That's not until the 17th century. There were, of course, Jews spread out throughout the Ottoman Empire, including living in the land of Israel. And so I don't have the population statistics here, but even before Zionism in, say 1850, there were, small groups of Jews who lived in places like Jerusalem and Jaffa and a lot of these cities. They weren't primarily motivated to live there by any political disposition. Again, for them, one, it was just home. They had lived there for, probably, 30, 40 generations at that point. But they were also mostly there for religious reasons. And actually, if you look back to history, there were plenty of times in Jewish history, Jews don't really have the same type of view of pilgrimage as, say, in the Islamic world you have Hajj, right, where it's, everybody's supposed to make at least one pilgrimage to Mecca in their life. Jews don't really have the same thing, right? There's nothing in Jewish tradition that says, every Jew should try to travel to Israel once in their life. But throughout our tradition, and especially the more mystical tradition, when we talk about Kabbalah and that legacy, there really was this heightened status placed upon the land of Israel that did lead to a lot of very famous pilgrimages in the medieval and early modern period. So just some famous, Judah Halevi, who was one of the most famous medieval Jewish philosophers and poets. He, at the end of his life, gets on a ship from Spain to the land of Israel and, ends up making it to the gates of Jerusalem. And, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who's, this famous Hasidic / philosophic / just fascinating character in his own right. He in the late 1700s also, makes his own pilgrimage to the land of Israel. And so it was always a land that attracted a very specific type of Jewish thinker that was very tapped into the more mystical leanings of our tradition. And so the Jews who lived there, again, they were mostly simple Jews, mostly very religious Jews. Some of them were there just for, pragmatic purpose. Maybe they grew up there, their parents were always there. Some might have been there as a part of different religious revivals. But they typically had very little to do with a lot of the early Zionists who were coming in. Not that they were necessarily diametrically opposed to Zionism. It's a more complicated relationship. But them living there, they weren't thinking in the, let's just pick a random year, 1820. They weren't sitting there thinking, oh, we should, build a Jewish state in this land.
Right, and that goes the same for a lot of people around the world. The idea of even nation states is sort of a modern idea to begin with. But the first part of the question, what do you say is and I think this is part of the problem why people sort of have an issue with understanding the Jewish / Israeli, let's just say Israeli point of view. What is the main justification? Because I feel like it's complicated, and that's the problem why it's hard to sort of because one side has a very simple argument, and it's sort of is easy to understand, but the Jewish / Israeli point of view it's actually really multifaceted and very complicated, and it's harder for it to be a popular viewpoint.
Sure. Yeah. Everything in Judaism tends to be complicated and multifaceted. It's sort of part and parcel. One of the problems that the Jews, even separate than Zionism or Israel, just thinking about this from a Jewish historical perspective, for the last 1,500 years, the Jewish world was basically split in half. Half of the Jewish world living under Christian rule, half of the Jewish world living under Islamic rule. And in neither of those two cases were the Jews the more powerful in the equation. So when we were in the Christian world, the Ashkenazi Jews were constantly under, Christian hegemony, In the Islamic world, Jews were seen as dhimmis or, second-class citizens. And so Jews have never been the primary, authors of our own political destiny in any meaningful sense for about 1,800 years. And so that also comes with, one, all of the negative ramifications of not having power in a world where, again, abuses of power were rampant against, Jews. Everybody, but specifically, talking from a Jewish perspective here, abuses of power were rampant to the Jewish community. But even secondary, people don't really think about it like this, but if Jews were living as minorities without a voice in these societies, it means that they were often their definition or their identity or an understanding of who Jews were was often pigeonholed into whatever the more dominant half wanted Jews to be. So in the Christian world, the wider Christian world wanted to pigeonhole Jews as, a group of conspiracizers who, ended up killing Jesus and, led to the blood libel and led to blaming the Black Plague on the Jews, We can sort of, roll out the many conspiracy theories of medieval anti-Semitism against the Ashkenazi or European Jewish community. And so just in sort of a broader sense, Jews and Judaism has always been deeply misunderstood because, again, part of being a minority that doesn't fit in with the neat categorizations that majority groups make of them, I think it's a lot of ways in which, our society talks about a lot of minority, I'm thinking, gender here, The majority group has these, categories or constructs that, oftentimes are not based in reality, but are based in this is how things have always been, or, the more powerful get to dictate the terms and conditions of, how the less powerful half lives, and they sort of force in these categories that don't fit for everybody. And so Jews were on the, bottom half of that equation for most of history, which has led to this deep misunderstanding of who and what Jews are. The most important thing to understand is that Jews don't fit neatly into categorization as a religion or ethnicity or really nation, Judaism and Jews are sort of a weird mixture of the three of them. And even as you said before, the idea of nation states being, last 200-year thing, which is certainly true, the idea of religion. The first time you see the word religion being used is also a couple hundred years old. The first time you see, ethnic or race being used is also a couple hundred years old. And so Jews have sort of always been, some concentric circle of, there's certainly such a thing as the religion of Judaism, but not all Jews are religious. There are certainly people that are atheist Jews, so they are Jews by ethnicity, but not by religion. One can also convert into Judaism, right? So there's all these ways of how these categories don't really fit in with the neat Western, or specifically the Christian concepts of what Jews are. So I think the first thing to understand when it comes to Zionism is that this is not a group of people that, based off of religious beliefs, are claiming a divine right to a land. And most early Zionists were actually quite secular, right? They were Jewish, they were strongly Jewish, but they had no divine beliefs about, their mandate to the land. So that's one important thing to understand. The second is, I think Zionism really is based off of a more universalized principle that a people should be in control of their own self-determination. So what I think an honest Zionist would say is that, the Kurds and, any other minority group, and by the way, the Palestinians, also deserve to have self-determination in the form of a state. And so I think Zionism, again, it operates as much more of a universalizing principle there. Happy to get into any more specifics about the history there, but I would say, it's based in this conception of Jews as a people, right? A people who were then indigenous to a specific land, a people who then really badly needed the right to self-determination. And it only made sense through, a confluence of historical factors that the location of this self-determination in the form of a state would be in the indigenous homeland of the Jews. Now, that statement, you'll see, or maybe listeners will hear in this, that doesn't preclude, say, a Palestinian state next door, a Palestinian state somehow engraved into it. So Zionism is not necessarily opposed, or somebody who's a Zionist need not necessarily be opposed to Palestinian nationalism or Palestinian statehood. And just the last thing I'll say before throwing it back to you, I think one of the grave injustices that's been done both to Israelis, to Palestinians, and also just in terms of this conversation, is the two have almost become opposites, right? So if somebody says Israel, a lot of people think the opposite in their head is Palestine. Or if somebody says Zionism, the opposite in their head is Palestinian nationalism, which I would say from a more philosophic perspective, right, there's no reason why that needs to be the case. And I think if and when, I'll say when because I'll be more optimistic today, there is a solution to the conflict that's been going on for, 100, 120 years, it needs to give truth to both of those claims.
All right, and this is a perfect time. We're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back. All right, we're back. This is KUCI 88.9 Irvine Cinéshow with Nima Golbabai and Rabbi Daniel Levine, professor at UCI. So we just sort of got into basic history. We're going to do about 10 minutes more of history, and then we'll get into the modern situation. And, it's like a huge event right now. So it's big. But the 1948 plan, just talk about, the areas where Jews were living. Did they or did they not constitute a majority in that area? How did they constitute a majority? Was the land fairly divvied up?
Just some simple questions. No, it's great questions, and you're asking the important ones. Just to, briefly fill in. So eventually, listeners hopefully are aware of, world politics. The Ottoman Empire falls to France and Britain in World War I. Britain ends up getting in control of that area, renames, what is called then British Mandate Palestine. And then eventually that makes way for what you were describing, the 1947 UN partition plan, where the UN finally, after, 30 years of British rule and it clearly not working in terms of, having Jews and Arabs and the British living, as three different entities that all have great reason not to like the other two. That's probably for another podcast, right? The UN finally decides to split the land into they called it partition. We can call it a two-state solution of having, a Jewish state and an Arab state side by side. The way that Jews acquired that land in the previous 30 years was mostly through, even going back before, the way that Jews acquired land from the Ottoman Empire was mostly by purchasing it. So the Zionist movement, ended up meeting, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And one of the things that honestly most of the early Zionist movement, actors were doing is it's not like, Herzl or, other contemporaries of early Zionist figures in, let's pick a random year, 1904. It's not like they were, moving to the land of Israel and, deciding where to build freeways. They were basically fundraisers, and they were basically fundraisers who were trying to convince the rest of the Jewish world, who at that point, still mostly lived in Europe. But there were a lot of American Jews at that time who were immigrating from Eastern Europe, and a lot of German Jews who were already in America from, other waves of immigration. They were basically trying to convince the wealthier Jews, typically the Jews who lived in America had more money than the Jews that were in Eastern Europe. And so they were basically trying to convince American Jews to fund projects to purchase major swaths of land for the Ottoman Empire. And so if you look at, a lot of just records, housing records or farm records or things like that, there were these huge pieces of land that the Ottoman Empire had owned for, hundreds of years, and maybe the Ottoman Empire had, rented out that land to, other farmers that were on the area. But really the early Zionist movement just bought up major swaths of land. And so that, of course, once there was land, then that land needed to be worked. And so a lot of early Zionists, are thought of almost as pioneers, right? These are sort of the early, more ideological people that were moving from Europe, most of them, living in, almost these socialistic communes known as kibbutzim, right? They were farmers, they were land tillers, they were basically taking a lot of this land. We're in a lot of the land, right? Not all of the land, but in much of the land of, Israel/Palestine, there were a lot of swamps, there was mud, there was sort of rampant malaria, right? There was a lot of desert, right? For people who know the landscape. And so a lot of this was figuring out how to turn that into, a land that can produce, say, oranges was actually a major export in the 1920s and 30s from British Mandate Palestine, mostly from, Zionist farmers who were tilling the land. And so it got to a point, again, where you had these two populations, right? You had the Jews and the Arabs. And, right, tensions were boiling. And, listeners can, if you just Google history of the, Israeli-Arab or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can sort of see what I'm talking about in terms of the tensions. And you can understand, why tensions are boiling. The UN decides to finally, the problem is kicked to the newly formed UN because Britain basically decides to pull out. And the UN decides, okay, we're going to split this land into two. And so the Jewish state, right, the way that the UN initially split it, and, for listeners who want a visual, you can just Google, map of the UN partition plan. The place in which was going to be the Jewish state, that was just the geographical area that had the highest percentage of Jews, and the Arab state was the highest percentages of Arabs. So by the time the problem got to the UN, it very much was, let's try to do a reasonable job at separating this, based off of population centers. Just one more important thing to add there, right? The Jewish side, of course, accepts the partition plan. So David Ben-Gurion accepts the partition plan, and a Jewish state is formed in 1948 based off of the partition plan. The Arab side, and really it actually, there are actually two reasons why I'm not saying Palestinians, I'm saying Arab. One, it's unclear in the 1930s and 40s if anybody in the area would have identified as Palestinian. And that's not a political comment against, Palestinian identity. It's more, this was at a time of more pan-Arab nationalism, where it would have been rare for even somebody in, Syria or Egypt or any of these places to have identified as, Egyptian over just Arab in general. And that's because, again, nationalism was this imported idea from Europe. So nobody was thinking in terms of, starkly nationalistic terms 120 years ago in the Middle East. The other way is because actually it wasn't necessarily what eventually became the Palestinian leadership that said no to the partition plan. They actually weren't really given that much of a voice. It was actually the leaders of other Arab countries that were around the area that said no on behalf of the Arabs that were living in British Mandate Palestine. And so what happened in 1948 was a huge war breaks out. And, Israel is then, the newly formed Jewish state called Israel is then attacked from really all sides. And again, somebody can look at a map of the 1948 war. And by the time the dust settles and the war ends, the borders of Israel are established. The borders are bigger than what the UN had initially offered to the Jews. And that was a result of the fighting. And, there's all sorts of different theories and opinions about what happened there. So, from a you can imagine the full range of opinions, through archival research. Was this Israel and the Zionist movement purposely, eradicating some villages of Arabs so that would be part of the Jewish state? Well, maybe. I'm sure that happened. Was it on the other way? Was that local Arabs that decided to join the other Arab neighboring countries and take up arms against Israel? And so Israel, this was purely defensive, but by the time the dust settled, those villages had basically been cleansed of people, right? Yeah, I'm sure that also happened, right? So some mixture there, right? There's no lack of a historic debate about what happened in 1948. I've always been convinced, by the way, that one litmus test, this is my opinion, to tell if somebody has done their due diligence in actually studying what happened in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is if you ask them what happened in 1948, if they give you a clear answer, either a clear answer that's pro-Israel, either a clear answer that's anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian, that means they haven't really done their due diligence, because in terms of the scholarly work that's been done on what actually happened there's so much disagreement there, and everybody's of course biased and motivated by ideology. So that's a separate tangent on the side there.
All right, yeah, I think now we're set to go into the more modern situation. And so basically Israel used to occupy like the Gaza and the West Bank by the legal definition of occupation, and they leave the Gaza and it becomes part of the Palestinian Authority. Then the Palestinian Authority is sort of like cooed out of power by Hamas, and they take over Hamas takes over the Gaza. And then fast forward, they make a very successful attack on the south of Israel. My first question is, a lot of people are confused about how it could even happen. How can Israel, they say like Israel has this most secure borders in the world, most militarized borders in the world, and I have a few points, and I just wanted to hear what you think, and then after I'll say what I've heard and some other points that I find interesting, but you go first.
Sure. No, you're right. That is the $1 million question. There's going to be, hundreds of books. I'm sure there are people doing their grad school PhD theses and that specific question of what happened on October 7th, 2023. I'll talk ideology for a minute because I actually think it's more relevant than any of the specific security things. We obviously skipped over a lot of history between 1948 and 2023. Yeah. So, listeners are if somebody really wants to learn about any aspect of this, they're going to need more than, an hour podcast or an hour radio show. So, granted that aside, I'll assume that listeners, sort of know the relevant history. And if there's anything I say that people don't know, just, feel free to Google it after. The theory that most of the security, including the government, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been prime minister in Israel for, in my opinion, way too long at this point, was that Hamas didn't really want a regional war. And that a lot of what Hamas had been doing in the last 10, but even really 20 years since you were talking about before, when they took over the Gaza Strip in 2007 or 2006, that Hamas was really on the path of evolving from this, militant terrorist group. And, again, it still had the sort of militant Islamic ideology, but it was sort of evolving into a political force, and a political force that can sort of take care of Gaza, and a convenient political force to basically let Israel not have to worry much about the future of Gaza, and for, prime ministers, including Benjamin Netanyahu, to basically say, Gaza's not our problem. It's over there. Hamas is in control. If anything terrible happens in Gaza, well, that is Hamas's fault because, they're not doing a good enough job because, they're turning a lot of their, international aid into rockets that they then launch into Israel, which, of course, had been happening over the last 20 years. But from Israel's point of view, the rockets were certainly, psychologically traumatizing. I don't want to downplay how the effect of having, rockets constantly launched at your cities. But Israel developed, security systems, the Iron Dome, other systems to basically make it, even more than livable, to basically ignore Gaza and what was happening there. And the theory of Israel was that nobody really wanted to mess with the stability, right? Israel didn't really want to mess with Gaza because, right, it's convenient for Israel to have Gaza be, seen as almost, some entirely different place that has no connection to what was going on in Israel and the West Bank and, all sorts of other, interesting things that we can get into, that Hamas, wanted to preserve the status quo because the status quo is that they're in power and nobody's looking at them too deeply. And, as you said before, because they had this sort of coup against the Fatah, the other, right, within the Palestinian Authority, that, right, Hamas is able to basically be an authoritarian leader of the Gaza Strip and, they have no rival. And so, they're able to stay in power. And it was sort of this, obviously not a peace treaty by any speck of the imagination, but it sort of hit some equilibrium that made it convenient for all of the different leaders in charge, right? That was sort of the theory. And the theory was that, all of this mixed with the fact that Israel has great intelligence and border security and all of these things basically made it that Israel didn't really have to focus on what was happening in Gaza. So a lot of that, what now we know to be clearly a, huge error of thinking, right? A huge rationalization error. A lot of people actually, just one interesting historic anecdote. In 1973, what's known as the Yom Kippur War, Israel was surprise attacked by Egypt and Syria. And this was, before October 7th, 2023, this was the most devastating war in Israel's history. It was basically exactly 50 years ago. And just to show how much our ideologies or philosophies of situations blind us to reality. So Israel was again operating under a similar theory in 73 about, well, Egypt and Syria don't really want to attack. They tried to attack us 6 years earlier in 1967. It ended terribly for them. And so they just want to, even though they're amassing forces at the border and saying on the radio they're going to attack Israel, they're just really saying that this is just, political strongmen trying to show their, the people in their country that, they're still strong. But, and Israel believed this so much so that as Egypt started amassing troops at the border, Israel, to show Egypt that, hey, listen, we know you're not really going to attack. We don't want a war. So Israel actually pulled back its army, which then, of course, created the opening for an Egyptian attack that ended up being much worse than if Israel would have actually responded to the early intelligence inklings. So almost the exact same thing happened on October 7th. There were sort of inklings that Hamas was running these, war simulations and was amassing troops and all of that. But within the higher-ups in the intelligence, there was sort of in this theoretical construct of there's no reason why Hamas actually wants to attack us, right? Even though, yes, of course, they, are, saying in their leadership and, Iran, which helps fund them, every, couple weeks, they say, death to Israel, death to America. They maybe ideologically they want that, but pragmatically, it's not really what they want, right? They just want, what most of us want, which, or what most political strongmen want, which is, leadership and political power and all these things. And so it was just a major lack of ability to understand what was in the minds of Hamas, which now since October 7th, and really we knew this, even from just reading their charter in 1988, I mean, this really is a group bent on the genocide of all the Jews living in Israel. And so it was sort of that, the obfuscation of their real goals. And Bibi Netanyahu was, both tricked and wrong at the same time. And I think, again, he is going to bear a lot of the historic blame for what happened for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I heard part of it could be that a lot of the military assets were moved to the West Bank. Is one of the reasons I heard that it may have happened. And obviously people have, and you kind of touched on it, that the Mossad knew that they were probably planning something a year before, but they thought it was an aspirational plan or something like that. But I'm not sure personally if I wouldn't place it all on Netanyahu's government, especially because there was so much chaos in Israel politically over the past whatever, when they started with the crazy election periods.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that screws the country up really, it when you have constantly changing governments and stuff. I also think that the fact that something like this could happen is like almost the reason why a guy like Netanyahu is popular, because it makes you paranoid, very paranoid, that like weakness is only exploited, like ultimately. And Netanyahu, whether you love him or hate him, has like a sort of not only his uh I don't know, not spirit, but like his
He has a very like strongman demeanor, right?
yeah, like
Yeah.
demeanor.
No, for sure. I mean, listen, that what you're saying might have been true before October 7th. I mean, I was not a Netanyahu fan for years. So, if we were talking, before October 7th, I'd probably push back in a small way. Now I'll push back in a more major way. Netanyahu ran on a strong security, right? Okay, taking a step back, there are different theories about how you actually obtain security in Israel. And so Bibi Netanyahu's theory was maintaining the status quo as much as possible, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, and just hoping that, if Israel just gets stronger and stronger, and both, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank gets weaker and weaker, eventually that will make Israel more secure. That's never really been a palatable theory to me. I mean, it never really made any meaningful sense. And so he basically took a gamble based off of his ideologic view. And I'll say also, you're right, the country and politics were in disarray before October 7th. A lot of that is due to a lot of Bibi's politics, and specifically with the judicial reform. And, for also listeners who are unfamiliar, I mean, one of the big things that's been happening in Israel before October 7th, because everything, changed after, but was this sort of judicial overhaul that was really spearheaded by Benjamin Netanyahu to reduce the power of the Supreme Court. And so just if we think back to, Politics 101, in most countries, the court system or the judiciary branch is the biggest check on power for the executive branch. And so, right, same within America, right? If the president does something that is considered, beyond the power or the scope of what the president could do, you have a constitution, you have a Supreme Court that basically comes in and tells the president, no, sorry, you are not allowed to decide, all Jews are not able to, go to public school anymore, right? Because, the Constitution and the judiciary branch would block that. So Israel, of course, functioned, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it basically functioned the same way. And so one of the things that Bibi Netanyahu tried to do over the last couple of years is basically reduce the power of the court. So basically tried to amass a lot more power as the prime minister. So a lot of the disarray that I certainly agree that the country was very internally caught up. I mean, you had people 3-4 months ago talking about how Israel over this past summer might, devolve into some type of, miniature civil war over how heated it was getting. I mean, you had massive protests on all sides. I mean, it was getting, dangerous. You were having, riots in the streets in some cities. So it was definitely chaos. So that also definitely adds to the disarray. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think if you are the head of a country, your first and foremost job is to keep the population of that country, physically safe. And so, of course, Bibi doesn't bear all the blame. I mean, again, when we're talking about blame, of course, Hamas bears 100% of the blame for why this happened. I mean, of course, their mindset is explicitly genocidal and conspiratorial and anti-Semitic. And, for listeners who think I'm being hyperbolic, I mean, you can read the Hamas charter. It's, published, it's translated for all to read it. But in terms of like from an Israeli perspective or from an Israel perspective of, obviously understanding that Hamas exists as an Islamist militant group, on its border, I think Bibi's going to have to at least bear the majority of the blame for this.
Yeah, I definitely think that like there is blame definitely with the leader of the country, 100%. But I think it remains to be seen how like the history books will judge him by how it turns out. That's how these things sort of end up. It's not really how you start, it's how you finish. But okay, let's talk about like public opinion outside of Israel. And like obviously there's these massive protests, and I find something interesting. So I don't know if this is a good place to talk about religion, because nobody really cares like like what, I mean, they care that like Jews say it's their homeland from like a religious point of view, but they don't really like take the specifically Orthodox Jewish perspective about like why stuff is happening, because they're not Jewish, and like you said, Judaism is really misunderstood. But like people accuse the Israelis slash Jews of like they say like they want to be victims or whatever, which is what I don't think is true. But
I would actually say it's explicitly not true. I would just throw.
Yeah, I'm going to that
Okay,
because
right.
like the Orthodox Jewish perspective is like when bad things happen to Jews, it's because of Jews like not following the commandments, like stuff like that, and like even with like really big tragedies like the Holocaust, like a lot of Orthodox rabbis like say, you know, it was because of leaving the faith or whatever, or not following the commandments. So it's like Jews have been either stereotyped or accepted the fact they're self-blaming. So I don't feel that criticism is true, but it attracts so much hatred, actually, because people don't like it when because the numbers are so disproportionate. They don't like that Israelis say like something's bad happens to us because it's been so far over on the other side. But why do you think that it's only turned into the oppressor oppressed narrative rather than like where the fault actually blames? And why don't people want one side to take responsibility when another side can take some responsibility to an extent? But I feel like the anti-Israel crowd really doesn't even acknowledge what Hamas did, like at least the more radical side, which I feel has a lot of momentum.
Yes and no. So one I'll just say, just as a throwaway line, many Jewish thinkers did push back on the Orthodox view of why bad things happen to good people. That's a whole separate conversation of, you know, this question of, you know, if bad things happen, is it, you know, the fault of spiritual activity? So just to sideline that, I'll say a couple of things. One, public opinion is not as skewed anti-Israel as I think a lot of people think. I think from the perspective of a liberal college campus in California, it certainly seems that way. There's been a series of national polls that have come out in terms of just, you know, asking, you know, are people happy with how much America's been doing for Israel? Do we think America is supporting Israel too much, or do we think America is supporting Israel not enough? And the majority of the people were either happy or thinks that America is not supporting Israel enough in America. And so you still have, I mean, the majority of America still, you know, is pro-Israel, still supports Israel, you know, understands that, you know, in a very broad sense, Israel is on the moral right of this equation. Certainly that's my opinion also, right? It doesn't mean that it's a binary. I don't think that, you know, one side is 100% right and the other side wrong. But I think the recognition that Hamas is a militant terrorist group with genocidal intentions and Israel is a flawed nation state, right? Flawed, but a nation state, you know, really trying to look out for, you know, the good of its citizenry, right? Like those are very different equations there. I think there are a lot of different frameworks to view this through. I'll throw out a couple because really I think they're all important. One, again, there has been a 2,000-year legacy of anti-Semitism throughout the Western world. And that anti-Semitism has taken, you know, forms of religious anti-Semitism in the medieval ages to economic-based anti-Semitism of claiming Jews are either the greedy bankers or, you know, the communists that are trying to take everybody's money, all the way to Jews being, you know, genetically inferior in Nazism, to, you know, Jews being in control of, you know, politics and the media with the Protocols of Elders of Zion in Russia in the early 1900s. And so, you know, there isn't anything in the history of the West that hasn't been blamed on Jews. And so from one perspective, and this is where you get into a lot of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism view, which I share a good amount, is just to say, okay, well, now, you know, now that our world thinks in terms of oppressor and oppressed, in terms of certain, you know, left-wing progressive viewpoints, well, it's no surprise that Jews are now being labeled oppressed, just the same way Jews are labeled, you know, Christ killers in the 1100s and, you know, the Black Death causers in the 1400s and baby killers in the 1200s and, you know, collapser of the economic systems in the 1900s, right? So from a global perspective, it's not from a Jewish perspective, it's not really surprising at all that there's, you know, all this heightened attention focused on, you know, what happens to be the one Jewish state. Second, I think the Arab world mixed with the former Soviet Union, and for people who don't know the history, this sounds surprising, but I just if you're at home and you're surprised to hear me bringing in the Soviet Union, just Google Soviet Union anti-Semitism, and just read the Wikipedia page on that, and then unpause this, and then you can listen to the rest. For people who understand, right, there was this very concerted effort to convince the rest of the world to view the Israeli-Arab or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of colonialism, which, from my opinion, and I think from the majority of people who truly understand this conflict, it's the wrong framework to understand it in. And so from a Palestinian or from a Hamas perspective, they think this is, Algeria with, the French colonizing Algeria, and all the Algerians have to do is make life as bad as possible for the French who are still living there, and eventually, after many bloody wars, the French leave and go back to France. And so that's the framework that a lot of people are operating under and think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that the Israelis or the Zionists are sort of this outside colonialist force, and that if you make things bad enough, they're going to leave. As opposed to understanding that the Israelis or the Zionists, they were not sent on behalf of any other group. There was no, motherland. There was no colony, right? They weren't coming on behalf of, trying to colonize any land. Like, they were coming with every intention, whether they were coming for ideological purposes or whether they were coming for very pragmatic purposes in terms of, later from, 1920 to, 1950 in Europe, they were coming to stay. And so I just think a lot of people have a incorrect framework, which, again, one, it's just sad that I think, it's untrue, but I actually think, just to go back to Palestinian statehood for a second, it does a disservice to the Palestinians, because, when you hear chants like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," it not only is that, sad to hear, because in a lot of ways it's a Hamas talking point, but even more than that, it's sad because the framework of the conflict, of thinking at the end of the day what's going to be standing is either Israel or Palestine, will almost certainly lead in the future of there just being Israel. I mean, and this is where you get into, again, the Palestinians have been sold this lie by the rest of the Arab world and by the Soviet Union, that if they just keep on, if they keep on their, struggling, and if they keep saying no to any peace treaties. I mean, there was the Peel Treaty in, the 1930s by the British. We talked about the partition plan before. There was the Oslo Accords. There was the 2000 peace treaty. There was the 2008 peace treaty. And in all these treaties, the Palestinian leadership or the Arab leadership said no to a Palestinian statehood because it wasn't from the river to the sea. And so, right, there's a lot to say about the hurtful, from how it hurts Israelis and Israel and Jews and blah, blah, blah. But even for listeners who care more about the Palestinians, that's a framework that's almost going to guarantee, one, to keep the conflict going for another 100 years. But as the conflict goes on, I mean, as you said before, Israel's only getting stronger and more stable. And, Israel, it seems now, this is actually one interesting way to view the conflict. It seems like Israel in 2024 is more disliked than Israel was, if you imagine, let's pick a random year, 1984, probably before most of the people listening to this were alive, also before I was alive. Israel's actually more liked on an international scale, because you have a lot of the Arab world, a lot of the Sunni Arab world, and specifically the leadership, but also, the business class and, the corporations. And, again, there's obviously a lot of, terrible things happening there, and, that's a whole separate, discussion to talk about. But Israel's only growing stronger in terms of international alliances. Sometime in the next 2 years, Israel's going to have a formalized peace treaty with Saudi Arabia. And so this sort of either or perspective, or black and white perspective, is not going to be good for anybody, but it'll almost certainly be worse for the Palestinians.
Yeah, I have like a few different, like, kind of unrelated things, but I gotta say them because I know I'm gonna forget them, and I don't have a paper to write it down. So the first thing I was gonna say is, like, the river to the sea thing. All you have to do is ask, like, which river and which sea. Like, I don't know. I feel like a lot of people don't know. Okay, next thing, about the colonization point. I wanna, like, compare it to, like, the Jewish idea of, like, being a light to the nations. meanwhile, like the whole accusation that any type of settlement and like improvement of an area is like negative colonization or whatever, when you compare it to like the Jewish idea that Jews are supposed to like not only improve like the world and like repair the world and do so much to like be an example for the world, which like Israel has improved the lives of the 2 million Arabs that live there undoubtedly if it had just been a Palestinian Arab state. And you can just look at any of the other countries for that comparison that don't have loads of oil. But I also have like a personal note. I actually have a communist cousin who is totally anti-Israel. I haven't seen him in a while, and I'm not a fan of communism and all that stuff. But on the anti-Israel part, I have actually seen like a clip of him in Minneapolis, which is a disaster city. He's actually like on the streets calling for intifada until victory. So there's sort of this alliance, and he like kind of hates Islam too. There's like an alliance between Islamic fundamentalists and like left-wing or even far left-wing ideologues on this issue of Palestine, and it's so violent, and it's like.
Well, you just have to look to the Soviet Union there. I mean, that's exactly. I mean, what was interesting about the Soviet Union was actually very pro-Israel in 1948.
Right.
The reason why they were very pro-Israel in 1948 was because I sort of alluded to this before with the kibbutzim, but Israel in 1948, 1949, 1950 was actually the best example of socialism working in the world. I mean, and so you had this, ideological battle between, socialism and capitalism, and Israel very much was a socialist, almost, the kibbutzim were basically communes, that, and it worked. I mean, a lot of historians think the only reason why Israel was actually able to survive in the first decade or two was because of the more socialistic mindset of, the whole country being united under this, one banner. And, basically it was, if you're looking, for historic examples of this ideology working, Israel was the best example. Over the course of the years, right, throughout the later 1950s and, specifically by the mid-60s, certainly by the 70s, for a lot of different reasons, Israel's economic system started to evolve. Israel started to ally itself more with the wider Western world. And so the USSR turned on Israel because now Israel was no longer this shining example of socialism that we can point to, but Israel was started to be unified with the sort of wider Western bloc of, started with France, but then eventually, it became America as, one of America's top allies. And the Soviet Union, again, this hard left revolutionary ideology, started then funding all these other Arab countries, right? Syria and Egypt and, even still to this day, by the way, I mean, Russia and Iran, Russia is probably the best example. I mean, obviously the Soviet Union fell, but Russia still bears a lot of the, there's a lot to say about how modern Russia evolved from the Soviet Union, but at a certain point in fundamentalism, once you go past a certain realm, it doesn't matter if it's right-wing fundamentalism or left-wing fundamentalism, you sort of hit an authoritarianism that, it's unclear, is Putin, far right or far left? Both. I mean, Putin wouldn't have gotten to where he is today if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. Putin obviously acts more like a right-wing straw man. So, it's some combination. But you see Russia and Iran as sort of big allies. And, China is, it's a little more complicated where China fits in. But China's also, funding a lot of the more, Islamist or, Arab countries against Israel. China's a little bit more complicated because it's also allied with Israel. But again, that's, this isn't the time for advanced geopolitics. So yeah, I mean, basically, you have this fascinating split where you can basically, if you ask somebody their opinion on the West or America, what do you think about America? If somebody says that America is, a great but flawed country that obviously needs improvement, but generally has been a good country and is getting better. And, of course, America was built on terrible things and there's still a lot of systemic problems in America. But, every generation is getting better and, there's a lot of redeeming factors in the American project. Or, of course, if somebody's like, yeah, America is the best place ever, that's almost always going to translate into them being quote unquote more pro-Israel. If you ask somebody about America and they say, well, America's terrible and America's, one of the most immoral countries in the world and it just funds all these, foreign wars, and America is, built on, is hopelessly, racist to the point that it can't be redeemed and needs to be torn down, that person's almost certainly going to be anti-Israel. And it very much does match up, which is why, again, on the one hand, it's concerning the rise of, staunch anti-Israelism. But at the end of the day, for people that are, deep thinkers that are committed to this project of liberalism and democracy that we're involved in and don't just want to, tear everything down, which again, I think, if we do have a future, it's going to be based off of liberalism and democracy, not off of revolution. Revolutions have seldom worked throughout history in the way that the revolutionaries wanted. I think Israel is going to be okay. I can't really imagine there ever being a time where, political activity in America ever switches to, being anti-Israel. And so, it is upsetting that there are, random 20-year-olds running around shouting Intifada. Probably they don't know what that means. So again, I'm, more willing to give them a pass, by, I don't think that they're terrible people. I just think that, they're trying to play revolutionary for a few minutes, so they don't understand that Intifada means, cafes blowing up and killing babies. But fine, I'm more than happy to, if the best, either way, I'll just, I can rant about this forever, but.
All right, we're going to take a little break and then we'll come back and close up. All right, see you later. All right, so we're back, and if you'd like to watch a 15-minute extended cut, let's say, of this conversation where we get into some things we missed, you can always go to my YouTube channel. You can just type in Cinéshow movies or Cinéshow KUCI, and you'll find it. But yeah, that sort of concludes our show here. Stay tuned on YouTube if you want to continue this conversation. I hope you learned some stuff, and I know it's a controversial subject, and especially probably at this school in California. But yeah, I mean, free speech is good, and I think I will talk a little bit more what I think about the activist movement in the extended version. So if you want to hear what I have to say, stick around. But if you want to say goodbye just for a minute here.
Yeah, well, I hope you all enjoy it. And just to say, there can be hundreds of pages of commentary on basically any sentence that was spoken. And so, just like any other issue, as I think it was it Socrates, he said, never trust the man of one book. And so, I'll say, never trust the person who, with one opinion. So if you want to actually understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, don't listen to any one opinion, including mine. Go out, talk to people, read stuff you disagree with, and, good luck on the journey studying, because it is not an easy topic to tackle.
All right. Thank you guys for listening. This has been Nima Golbabai on my show, Cinéshow, KUCI 88.9 Irvine. I'm with you to the end of the line. Okay, so this is the extended portion here of our conversation that aired on KUCI. But I think I'll start off, we'll talk a little bit about, I think, the social backlash. I think I would respect it more if, it seems like very targeted towards Israel, and also it would be more believable if the Middle East wasn't an incredibly unstable, violent area where, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people die in civil wars, in military operations, whether it's Yemen or Syria or Iran and Iraq back when they had a war. That one's less modern. But all the arguments against Israel would be much more compelling if they were actually in a region and surrounded by these utopias that never kill anybody and nobody dies unjustly. And yeah, it's awful to see the images of the death, and I see plenty of it. I'm on Twitter, and I get lots of anti-Israel stuff, even though I'm pro-Israel, but I get lots of very anti-Israel stuff. Some of it I wouldn't consider anti-Semitic, but some of it is like incredibly racist. It's just, and it's so vicious. It's like very deep. It's not like just do a ceasefire. It's like talking about something about the character of Jewish people. But yeah, to me, that's one of the problems I have with the anti-Israel activism, is because it's devoid of context, and all the people on the left always talk about how important context and nuance is, but not on this issue. For some reason, it's very, very clean cut, and if you bring up any nuance or the reason why something's happening or how wars are fought, it's like, no, you cannot bring that up. So what do you think?
Well, I think I agree with that, with one caveat. I don't think actually what's become of the left is interested in nuance on a whole host of other issues. I mean, I think liberals, I consider myself a liberal. Liberals want nuance.
Right.
I don't think that what the progressive movement in America has evolved into is very fond of nuance, because I do think if you're trying to reduce the world into, binaries of, oppressor, oppressed, or in America, you have, same thing basically, good and bad and, all these different things. Any nuance just gets in the way because the world is fundamentally complex. And so to understand the world, you have to embrace complexity. But basically all fundamentalist movements, it doesn't matter if it's political, religious, ideological, whatever, are based in trying to prove that the world is simple. And then you have a lot of explaining to do if the world is simple, because then you have to explain why, this thing seems confusing and that thing seems confusing. But generally, good not good in terms of moral, but, developed fundamentalist ideologies have a way of making the world very simple. This is true in a religious sense also, in terms of, there's the good and bad and the holy and the profane and everything like that. So I think, again, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a great litmus test, I think, to just one's ability to critically think about things in the world in general. And I think people that, are out there either explicitly or more likely accidentally supporting Hamas, I think that belies a certain understanding of the complexities of the world.
Right. I just thought of something, but I need your help to get me to finish it, because I don't remember it as good as you will. But so there's this idea that any resistance is justified. You hear that a lot, but it reminds me of this story that I learned in your class about when the Jews were in Babylonia, the story about gashing or throwing the babies against the rocks, and then the one rabbi said no, don't, integrate, make the society better. Can you share that story a little bit?
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, so it's one of the famous Psalms. It's Psalm 137, when the ancient Israel, just for the historian nerds out there, in the year 586 BCE, so this is about 2,600 years ago, the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, came in, destroyed Jerusalem, and forced out the Jews who were there to march over to Babylonia, where they spent the next couple generations. And a lot of the literature that we have from this time is quite obviously very both sad and lachrymose, but also angry. And so you have this famous Psalm 137, where at the end of the psalm it says, "Happy is he who takes the Babylonian babies and dashes it against the rocks." And it's a stunning line, because most people who think of biblical literature, they're not expecting to find a line about taking revenge to that extent. But then you have sort of what's considered by a lot of historians to be the sort of hero of the Babylonian exile, which is a prophet named Yirmiyahu, or Jeremiah in English. And Jeremiah writes this, very important letter to the community, and basically tells the community, not only should you not resist in any way, right? You should, live normal lives, build houses, build vineyards, all those things. We're actually going to institute a ritual where the Jews in Babylonia need to actually issue a prayer for the Babylonian government or the Babylonian Empire. And so he almost flips this impulse of basically, saying, Judaism had a very real chance. I mean, the reason why this is so important historically is because Judaism had a very real chance of basically dying out. If Judaism would have revolted against the Babylonian Empire, we wouldn't be sitting here today. There'd be no Jews today. I mean, we'd be read about in history books the same way you've never met a Canaanite, or you've never met a Babylonian, or you've never met an ancient Greek. Right, the same way, Jews would be we'd be an interesting, maybe in the history class, you take a class on, Jews of antiquity, and then, okay, cool, maybe there'd be one museum, somewhere in Jerusalem, but in order for any tradition to move on, you need to be able to pivot and be pragmatic and understand when to resist, when military is justified, when peace is justified, and again, I mean, not that I think by any means it's a one-to-one comparison, so I don't want to be mistaken for thinking about that, but I do think, again, this idea of Palestinian resistance at all costs and in any way, right, October 7th is not making it more likely that Israel will cease to exist. It actually only makes it more likely that Israel will continue to exist, because now Israel is getting the support from all of these other Western governments. I mean, the amount of money America has given Israel in the last couple of months is, astounding, right? And, whatever one thinks about that, Israel is making sure to develop even more security systems, to beef up its military even more. The amount of GDP in Israel that's going towards national defense is going up. So if anything, this just makes Israel more emboldened, more rooted, and again, less likely to trust any future Palestinian national movements that come. And so it's, again, just sort of what I said, 30 minutes ago. It's just the wrong way to go about it. And I understand from I don't agree with it, but I understand the impulse of, if one thinks, if one has the incorrect framework of understanding the conflict, I understand the impulse to just say, well, yeah, whatever they have coming at them is deserved. But I don't think that's just not a framework that's going to lead to any solutions. And so even if somebody disagrees with everything else, I have to say about the right for Israel to exist and the history and blah, 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 there's also this question of, what do you actually want the situation to be like in 20 years? And I can guarantee you the situation for Palestinians growing up today is not going to be better in 20 years through another intifada and another uprising. It's only going to get better with ability to come to the table, to talk, to try to figure out, let's negotiate, right, and all of that.
Right. I see. I totally misunderstood. It's because I haven't got to that part of the Bible yet. So, but yeah, I do remember now. It wasn't a rabbi. It was a prophet. Okay. But yeah, they need to make a deal.
There's a bad joke that I'm gonna butcher it because I'm forgetting the setup, but basically it's what's the difference between a rabbi and a prophet? Is that rabbis make no profit? It's basically a joke about how little money rabbis make. I don't know, whatever.
Okay.
It's they're like is a way. I'm sure more creative listeners can tie that into a good joke.
Oh my God, I have the greatest Jewish joke of all time, but it's way too dirty to talk about on the air. So no, forget it. I think another part of the Bible, there's a time for peace and a time for war, right? Is that one? Did I get it right?
That is. That's in Ecclesiastes.
Okay,
thank God. Or
Kohelet. So you gotta know at some point when something's done, and I feel like I do understand the rage and anger on the Palestinian side, especially obviously if an Israeli airstrike killed your child or your mother or whatever, you're gonna be, a lot of people will want to take revenge and stuff, so that's just human nature. It's how it works. But is it good? No. And is it actually logical? No. And I think the Palestinians, they could have a way worse negotiating partner on the other side. There's many other countries, back to the Kurds, the Iraqis and the Kurds, for instance, that was an actual genocide, right? And that's the type of person they could have sitting at the opposite of the table. But when, yes, the power imbalance is weigh in Israel's favor, but at some point you gotta just put down arms and accept that you gotta move on. And I really liked that, learning about that part from the Bible, and I just thought of it in my head, like, yeah, at some point you just gotta like say, let's just build instead of, tear stuff down.
Yeah, and I mean the true shame about Gaza is that in 2005 Israel disengaged, so Israel pulled out from Gaza, and that was almost 20 years ago. And basically, I mean, again, it was no, it wasn't a state by any means. So, but it really was an opportunity for Palestinian leadership to set up some, a real stable, right? It was a perfect test run for what a Palestinian state could be. And I think if history would have played out differently, and if Palestinians had built up Gaza to be, almost another, again, it's a beautiful area. It's right on the coast. It's, an incredible location, right? It's right where Africa and Asia really meet, right? If you think about where the Gaza Strip is. And so there was a lot of potential, right? It's right on the, important trade route. And so, it really could have paved the road for I think, Palestinian self-determination in the form of a wider state. And I think if Gaza would have, again, if the leadership, whether it be the Palestinian Authority or Fatah or even Hamas, if they would have taken advantage of the opportunity, instead of turning, Gaza really was turned into a rocket launch factory. I mean, again, as the IDF is, combing through Gaza, they're finding under hospitals, under preschools, under, civilian streets, under, shops, all these different, rocket manufacturing places or rocket launch sites. And, of course, we know about the ubiquitous tunnel network that's, over Gaza. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent building these, war tunnels under Gaza so weapons can sneak in from, the Sinai, in Egypt, and basically Hamas members can sneak in and out, which is how, historically one day they're in Gaza, the next day they popped up in Qatar and, in all these places. And so it's a real missed opportunity. And I think, again, obviously the optics look terrible for Israel now, but people who actually understand the situation know that, of course, anytime, civilians are injured and hurt or caught in fire, it is terrible. But at the end of the day, this lies solely on the, shoulders of Hamas, who really, again, this was a fundamentalist, ideology instead of any type of ideology that was, how do we actually create a good future for Palestinians, and how do we build the state up into a example of what future Palestinian statehood could be? So, I think historically, it's, again, a huge missed opportunity. And, I have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, I think one of the big political questions now is what's going to happen. What's the future of Gaza going to be? Because, if and when this, Israeli offensive against Hamas ever ends, the place is going to be, the infrastructure is basically all going to be destroyed. There's going to be probably a political vacuum. And so there's going to be this big question moving forward of, who or what is going to take its place.
Yeah, it's going to be historic. And it appears, would you just quickly agree that it's probably going to be months until it's fully over? Yeah.
I think, the war in Gaza, I think, will definitely take months. And I think also in the next, year, there's going to be a major war in Lebanon. I think that, I'd be shocked if in the next year, Israel and Lebanon didn't go to war, specifically Hezbollah, right? Another Islamist, Iran-backed, militant group that, by the way, has the UN had a resolution in 2006 as to where Hezbollah could be, how close to the border. And Hezbollah has, routinely broken that without any, UN pushback. And so Israel is almost certainly going to go to war with Hezbollah unless something drastic happens. I mean, already you see America and you see the Lebanese government, which Hezbollah is a part of the Lebanese government, but not the entire government, trying to reel back in Hezbollah. But again, I'd be surprised if this ended without a major war. So I think the next 10 years in the Middle East are going to be filled with a lot of war, and it's a tragedy because it's going to be painful for all involved. I know at the end of the day, Israel's going to, be okay. I mean, certainly it'll be a tragedy as, Israeli lives are lost, through the offensives. But, Israel's going to exist in the year 2034, let's just say, 10 years from now. But I think, the question of what other regional players are going to be, or the safety of either the Palestinian people or the Lebanese people, or let's say the Iranian people, right? That really does. The future lies on the shoulders of their government. And, again, things are heating up. I mean, we're seeing, with the Houthi attacks, that's another Iranian-backed terrorist group, on American ships, and, that back and forth. So, hopefully this doesn't lead to a huge war. But I really think the future of what happens in the Middle East lies on the shoulders of the wider Arab leadership and the Iranian leadership. Because, again, I mean, just the moral framework. If today, Israel decided to stop fighting, they would all be killed. And, if today the Arab world decided to stop fighting, there'd be peace. And so, right, that to me, that is a helpful, right? It's not the whole answer to the problem, but it does give you a broad sense of, again, one side really does want to kill everybody on the other side, right? Hamas or Hezbollah, and one side does not want to be killed. And so, when it comes to these, terrorist factions, I think, whatever their future looks like, it's going to depend on their decisions.
And how are we doing on your time? Are you ready to
Let's
go?
do 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Yeah, all right. I'll just, on like the next 10 years in the Middle East, I think a lot of it honestly depends on the condition of the United States and whether there's a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, which obviously has been derailed at the moment, but it probably will get back going after the war in Gaza stops. But I'm optimistic, and this election is gonna be it's gonna be crazy. We'll see what happens, and I think the next 4 years will be very exciting, either in a bad way, or maybe it'll be better than I think. But I don't know. I'm hoping that there isn't a lot of war in the Middle East in the next 10 years.
No, hopefully, yeah, and definitely praying for peace for the innocents on all sides.
Yeah. All right, so that was the extended section. I wish, maybe we started a bit earlier. We could have got more, but I think we did a good job. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it was good. This was, again, with all the caveats of, an hour or hour and a half is never a substitute for in-depth learning.
I know, it's so complicated. It's almost like I gotta have an essay here written and just go through it. It's
Basically
very difficult. It's so hard. You're you're much better at talking than I am. But me, it's I'm way better at I have to see what I think, or else I can't think of it.
Got it. Well, anyway, thank you again.
All right, that's great. All right, see you guys.